Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jacob Restituto, and I'm a musician from Northport, New York. And today we have the absolute pleasure of having Juan and Saucy Peña on the channel. It is an absolute pleasure. As a 20-time platinum and 3-time gold certified mixer and recording engineer, really appreciate you taking the time to be on the channel, man. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, man. No problem.
Absolutely. So, for the people that haven't heard much about you and all the stuff that you had your hands on, can you give a little bit of backstory on who you are and what you do in the music industry?
Sure. I am pretty much like a mixing, sometimes recording engineer. Sort of, you kind of fall into different roles depending on the gig.
Sure.
But my primary role and like a lot of the records I'm a part of is usually engineer and then mixing engineer. Sometimes you kind of come into them in different parts. Sometimes you'll be the person recording it. Sometimes I get called when it's already been recorded. So you never really know, but you're kind of ready for whatever comes your way.
So let's start off with a super beginner question for the people that might be just joining in the music industry, and it took forever for me to even figure this out when I was first starting off as a musician. Can you give the super basics of the difference between a engineer, a mixer, and somebody that produces? Super basic question.
Gotcha. So I mean, even producers kind of like have different sort of definitions, but as far as an engineer, it's usually somebody who is working the rig, like the DAW, and kind of facilitating what the producers or artists is trying to do. So as a recording engineer, you're sort of there, whether it's with the artist or songwriter, to keep everything going, capture ideas, kind of like if they want to mess with arrangement sort of thing, you do that on the fly, so like the creativity sort of keeps going. As a mixer, all those decisions have already been made, and usually what you're given a lot of the time is like a final arrangement with the sonics they're trying to work with, and your job is more kind of making everything work together. So like if maybe two guitars are clashing, you gotta try to figure out how to make them work so they can both be heard and the producer's vision can kind of come to life, or the artist.
Absolutely.
Whereas a producer, I kind of see them in two categories. There's people who are, the beat makers who like they do a lot of amazing work and they create vibes. And then there's also the other side where a producer is like the person who will work with the artist and, sort of create an experience, an arrangement, so whether it's making the decision of like, there's too much going on in the bridge, let's take some stuff out, or even in the recording process, I think of producers as like, the person that's trying to get the best performance out of the artist,
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's kind of how I look at it.
Almost to some degree, they can fall into a songwriter category too, like saying, hey, why don't we switch this section over here? Why don't we move this over here, kind of thing.
For sure, yeah. There's times where it's like, sometimes they've been living with a version of the song and it takes somebody kind of going like, does this really work? Why don't we try this? And then that's the thing that kind of like makes the song, go from like 80% to like 100. It's,
Absolutely. So I appreciate you taking the time to explain that for people that might not have known right off the bat. But now let's talk about engineering. In your personal experience from all that you've worked on, how much do you find that you're kind of more, like how much input do you feel comfortable giving artists and stuff when they say, hey, can you do this? Will you sit there and be like, hey, what about this? Or do you just kind of like work with what the artist gives you?
So I always sort of gauge it, and like I tell this a lot to people, like a lot of what I find myself doing is like you have to be technically savvy and make everything work. But there's also a lot of like psychology and stuff going on where you like sort of read the room. So you kind of like, get an understanding early on. It's like, okay, do they value my opinion? Are they going to want it? Or if I say something, am I going to kind of overstep and they're going to be pissed at me? And like the people I've worked with, I've sort of developed relationships over the years. So like I'm comfortable and they kind of take my input, into consideration. But if it was me sort of getting thrown into a session where I'm just meeting the person, I would sort of, gauge it and, kind of see how it goes, like test it a little bit. And, it's never a bad idea to give your input, but you kind of get an idea.
Yeah, it's pretty for somebody that is relatively savvy at reading reading the room. For most people that are, you can kind of tell really quickly whether or not the person's interested in your opinion. Or not.
I've had those sessions where I'm like, dude, I'm just a button pusher today. That's cool with me, or like, cool, I'm more involved in the record,
Sure, absolutely. What have you found? This is a super selfish question because I'm super curious. What have you found typically as an engineer really helps your workflow? Are there things that
For
you
me,
put into place that really like just take things to the next level, or speed or quality?
I mean, speed, in my opinion, is like in this day and age is everything. So I would say like preparation is key.
In what
Um,
sense?
Again, depending, I sort of have like three different templates that I start with. Like one is sort of my basic. This is just a session I got a call for, so it's like basic effects and like workflow that I have, and then I have like two kind of bigger main clients that I work with. So I have like more specialized templates for what they, I'm almost like anticipating what they're going to ask for. So I have everything ready to go. So when they do, I don't have to like take the extra second to like set it up, which, in the grand scheme of things is an extra second. It's not really that long of a time, but like when you're sort of in that moment, an extra second is like the difference between, life and death.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was just literally filming a video, maybe within this week, talking about the fact like I'm redoing my studio, I'm in the next couple of weeks. I'm redoing my studio and taking a wall down and just restructuring it because I need more space. And like it's as simple as taking a little wall down, but the difference between that is okay. Now all this other gear that I haven't been using can be permanently set up because, like, for example, recording my guitar, like. I have the idea, but then the idea of, okay, gotta bring out the amp, gotta set up, like, plug in the pedal. Like, that barrier to entry now kills the desire to be creative. But if it's all
it does, because, like, I think of it as, like, there's, like, the creative part of your brain and then the technical part of your brain. So, like, a lot of times when you're an engineer, you're in the technical side of things. But me being, because I used to be a musician first, so I sort of, like, think, I'm like, if I were in this position, like, this would kill my vibe. And like the 3 minutes it takes to set up, like by then I'm like, oh, whatever, dude, it's fine. Like,
well, you start then at that point as an artist, sometimes you'll start overthinking the idea that you had. You're like, oh, this would be a killer guitar solo here. And then you have those 3 minutes, you start thinking and you start questioning yourself. Right. All these things happen in those 3 minutes.
Is this a good idea? Whereas like a lot of the time you just get it down and like if it works, but you tried it. Sometimes it's dope and sometimes it's not, but like just getting it out,
100%, man. So you're saying speed's everything. What about like just from a technical aspect? Do you have any like tips or tricks that you like doing to help with your workflow in general?
So typically, I use like a record track. So my main template, it's usually I'll have groups of tracks, whether it's leads, backgrounds, or ad libs. And I typically start with maybe like 4 tracks, and all those will get sent to like a bus, so I can control like in a macro sense. But I have like my own, like a record track that, I'll kind of move up and down the session depending on what we're doing. So if we're doing leads, I'll kind of bring the record track up to where the leads are. And, I'm kind of keeping up with producer or vocal producer on like what I'm keeping, and I playlist everything. Cause a lot of times in pop music, we'll have like 80 takes and then we'll go back and like comp everything, so we'll listen to everything.
Oh my gosh, it's like a engineer. I don't. Is that the engineering job or the mixing job to go through those comps? No,
so typically it's engineer, like mixers, and I mean it depends on the situation, but a lot of times
they usually just get the stems. Yeah.
Yeah, by the time the mixer gets it, like the comp is done. Usually it's like tune time if it needs it, and then it's sort of like as close as they can get it to the final product, and you take it that little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually interesting because I guess typically when I think of engineering, I think of, you're right, the person working the studio essentially, but then there's that middle ground of, well, who's the one deciding all those comps? You take 80 vocal comps. Who's that one? Is it
right? Is
that typically the engineer, I guess, or the producer? Who typically?
So it can be, but in my particular like experience, like I've been working with a vocal producer slash like songwriter. So like when I tend to do those sessions where we're comping a lot, it's me working the rig, and then it's her kind of making those decisions. But then because we've done it so much, like we'll typically agree on certain ones, and if I like one more than the other one, then we kind of like go back and forth. But then I've also been in situations where I got hired to be the recording guy, and then when I get there, it's like me and the artist, and they're looking at me for like sort of guidance. Is like, was that a good take? What do you think?
Sure.
So it can be.
You gotta
both.
put on your producer hat.
Exactly. Exactly.
Absolutely. No, that's really interesting for sure. So I'm curious, when now switching over gears to mixing, now you're on the other side of the table essentially, or other side of the booth, whatever you want to call it. Are you typically mixing in the box or out of the box?
So right now I'm 100% in the box. Like I've been sort of toying with the idea of getting some nice like analog pieces for my mix bus, but in my head, like if I'm gonna do that, they have to be like stepped controls because the way it is now, especially for like the kind of music I'm working on a lot, the tweaks and like notes are endless. So like if you have something that's easy to recall, it's great. Otherwise, like it's a nightmare because it could be like the day before the record's coming out, and then they'll hit you up with like new vocals they want you to add. So it's like which is
Recreating that sound with analog
yeah.
gear.
And I don't get me wrong, I love gear and I love consoles, but like I've tried it and they usually I'm like, this sucks.
Yeah, man,
You know?
it's really, really interesting. Just the more and more I hear and I learn from and talk to these people like you know, in the industry, been in the industry for a while, the more I'm surprised to hear how many people are mixing in the box and mixing, you know, using plugins, and it's just blowing my mind because it just breaks every rule that I thought I knew as a, you know,
But
kid
totally.
growing
I
up in the
mean,
music industry, man. You think you need this whole 32 track thing,
oh
analog Neve
yes.
console, you know, like, but it's really interesting to hear how many hit records and great records and or Grammy nominated, Grammy, whatever the case is, like, are being produced all within a computer, and it's like,
Oh, it's
or
crazy.
I'm
I
sorry,
mean, like
mixed. We're talking mixing here, but like mixed
even
right in.
even the production side too, like it's all sort of like been minimalized, so it's like there's no excuse now. You can't really say like, oh, I need all this stuff. Like
Well,
you
that's
just
the beauty of it, because you easily disqualify yourself because you're like,
right.
oh, I don't have a 50,000 Neve SSL studio or SSL console or Neve console.
Right,
Like,
like
I can't make a good song. But that's not the case. So it's
no,
humbling
it's
because
true.
it's
And
like, oh shoot, it's actually me that's the issue, not my gear.
even with the mixing thing, it's like, oh, I don't have the gear of that. And then like, I mean, you look at somebody like Serban. Serban is all in the box, from what I understand, and like everything you hear on the radio, like it's him. And like the only dude that does an amazing job and still does like the old school way that I know of is like Manny, because he actually mixes on like an SSL.
Hmm.
But you know, he's perfected his workflow. For somebody like me, like I've sort of tried it, and I'm like, dude, it's easier just to kind of like recreate the console in the session. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So tell me about that. How do you do that? What does that mean to you? Recreating the console inside the session.
I think of it, you know, the same way you would take a Pro Tools session and like stem it out on the console. I try to do a similar thing where I'll use like auxes essentially, and like you try to add color by like using plugins. Whether it's, I mean, sometimes I'll use like an SSL channel or like saturation plugins. Like a good one I use sometimes is free, is like the soft tube saturator. So it's just creating that where it's, you know, you're trying to do what the console does naturally, but like digitally, you know.
Yeah.
And like the more and more like the plugin companies like are developing stuff, they're getting pretty close, man. Like I don't know if you've ever gone to like AES or NAMM, but I remember UA had, it was like two buttons, and one of them was like the real unit and one of them was the plugin. And it's so hard, like a lot of times I'm like, I think that's the one, and like you can't really tell. So I'm like,
Yeah.
it's crazy.
A difference between a $300 plugin and a $50,000 console.
Yeah, like,
Yeah.
and you can only use like the hardware in one instance, whereas the plugin you can use as many times, you know.
Well, that, and then the best part is here we are mixing all this stuff, and people are listening on their little tiny little AirBud things. You know what I mean? Well, and
that's the other part that like the more I started mixing, I sort of started taking into account, because like somebody like me will notice like little nuances, and like I'll obsess over little things until like I think they're perfect. But I get to the point where I'm like, you could tweak forever, and you kind of have to look at it from like the average person's perspective.
Yeah.
And I'm like, dude, this is fine. They're not gonna, you know, like this is good.
Yeah, I was just talking to I guess an engineer, is his the hat he was wearing on this day, and he was setting up a studio for a production house. They were doing like an audio tape, I guess, is like a book recording essentially. And they were creating,
gotcha.
they
Like
were
an
creating
audiobook
this
thing?
whole an audiobook, yeah. So like they were creating this whole like studio for building the studio out, and like the I guess producers of the track, like now I guess producers in the sense of like the executives, not necessarily the creatives, the executives.
Gotcha.
Were like, yeah, but you can hear you like, oh, they were being super nitpicky, and like meanwhile it was like pretty top notch, you know what I mean? And the funny part is like, as being on the other side of it, somebody that makes music and understands a bit more like of the industry, like Yeah, but this guy that's going to be listening to that audiobook is going to be at the gym with 75 people around him, or on the bus on the way to work, or walking his dog. Where like he's not going to hear that tiny little thing. Like we obsess about, myself included. Sometimes we obsess about these little details. Oh, the snare's a little too high at 4K, and like nobody's going to know. You know what I mean?
Yeah. For me, it's just like I always try to like give myself like a standard, and like I'll always do it even if like I'm like no one's gonna notice this, but like I'm gonna know that I delivered the best possible thing I could. And like even when we've done like vocal production, like I was telling you, where we'll go through 80 takes, like there's been times where in the beginning of it I'm like we're cutting like the and the of like the word the, for instance, like minute stuff no one's gonna notice, and like you think this is ridiculous, like what are we doing? And then when you sort of like hear the final thing, you're like, you know what? It like, I get why we did it, and like it made the difference. No one might notice it, but if you like change it, that it's the sort of thing where a lot of people say it's like I don't, something's off. I don't know what it is, but something's off.
Yeah.
That thing. And that's where I find like those little things that will make the difference, but a lot of times people don't know exactly why.
Absolutely, it's such an interesting debate too, though, like that I'm constantly trying to figure out, and I think it'll be a lifelong pursuit of when to do those minute changes and when those minute changes are unnecessary and kill the track. Because I sometimes go in that opposite direction. It's like, let's perfect everything, and then it sounds like this sterile piece of nothing. You know what I mean?
True.
So it's like this weird battle, because sometimes that little difference does make the difference. But then it's like it's too much, and it's like this constant debate. It's like what's the right answer, and both are yes. You know what I mean? It's just depending.
No, I agree. I think especially too when it comes to whether people use, like, for instance, tuning. There's like sort of two schools of thought where it's like it's either for effect purposes, or maybe this is the only time we had with the artist, we got everything we could, and like maybe there's like a sour note you have to fix, and like it's sort of making that organic and emotional, as opposed to like you're saying making it sterile, and where you're like this doesn't even sound like a performance. This is just like somebody kind of like talking or singing.
But both work, which is funny. Like it depends on the song. There are plenty of like multi-platinum tracks where it's like, wow, this is a really produced pop vocal, and it works. So it's like, who knows, man? Yeah. We'll never. If we knew we'd be the number one in every industry, right? We'd have all the answers, right? Oh, exactly, shoot, it's man. So funny. So I'm curious from your perspective, though. Now that we're talking about good, quote unquote, good mixes and stuff, I'm curious how you define. And there's no right answer to this because it's super subjective. But how do you define a good mix?
For me, a good mix, like, and I tend not to sort of be very like super technical. For me, like when I think of like a good mix, I think of a track that sort of just sits well, it's comfortable to listen to, like nothing's harsh, nothing's sticking out, like I can hear everything, there's still sort of emotion behind it. And then also like the creative part of it, for instance, like depending on the song, like are you using effects to sort of tell the story, which I think it's like a part that a lot of times gets, depending on the deadline, can get lost. Because like,
elaborate on that. I'd love to hear more on what you mean by that.
So instead, really like you think of a mix, you think of like, okay, I'm trying to make this song sound as good as it can, but, and then for me, I get to that point where it's like, great, it sounds good. Like now let's get to the good stuff, which is sort of like listening to the lyrics of the song. And if there's like a sad part, how can I take that sad line and enhance it? So maybe it's like a dramatic reverb throw or something to make the vocal stand out. Like the one I can think of that's always like the ones that come to mind, it's like there's a Billie Eilish song with the mixer Rob Kinelsky. The line is like her head's underwater and he filters her voice and it literally sounds like she's underwater. So like that sort of thing I love to try to like incorporate in mixes I do, because it's the difference between like, oh, this sounds good, to wow, this is like a story and like this enhanced the song,
Absolutely. I completely understand what you're saying. I feel like to some degree, being fully honest, I feel like that's not done enough. I feel like the fact that we notice when it happens means that it's not happening in every track.
I always try to just get like the sonic part of it done, and then like when it sits well, that's when I sort of put on my producer. I'd be like, what can I add subtly that's gonna like not get in the way, but it's gonna like they're gonna hear it and be like, holy shit, this is
Yeah,
dope.
it makes a difference. It's the ear candy. It's not. I wouldn't know if I would consider that ear candy, but like it's like you said, production or storytelling through engineering, essentially,
Exactly.
which is a really really cool concept, and I think it makes a big difference in the end. That would 100%. That's a great answer. I really appreciate that answer.
Yeah, man, that's like I say, that's the fun part. Like that's the
Yeah.
part I look forward to. Like once everything sits well, I'm like, okay, like let me get to it, you know? Like,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Now, on a slightly different perspective or question, but kind of in the same line of it, is working on so many songs that you have and so many that have done so well, quote unquote, to the standard of music. How do you define a hit song, or what do you think? It's a two-part question. How do you define a hit song, and the follow-up to that will be, what do you think makes that a hit song?
man, I would say, I mean, a hit song is just something like a song that just resonates with like a lot of people in like a sort of very broad or specific way, depending on how the song is laid out. And like, obviously, like, you know, you have to kind of gauge the commercial success or how much it sells. But for me, it's just something that sort of resonates with the audience they're trying to reach and like connects. And, you know, clearly the outcome, you know, the response from that audience is like clear. And I mean, as far, what was the second part? As far as,
So, how do you think that they achieve that? So, like, how the one with the first part you answered, thank you, with how do you define it? Now, what do you think leads up to that? Again, completely subjective. If
yeah,
we knew that,
it's
we'd
funny because I feel like sometimes you have an idea that it's going to be a big song, and then there's other times where, you know, people really have no clue. Because I've sort of been in both situations. So, like, the first big record I've ever worked on was with ASAP Ferg. It was Plain Jane. And we did that record. It was like 3 a.m. It was like a typical, because I used to work with him like every day. We did that for like a year and a half, almost 2 years. And it was just like another typical day. No one really thought much of it. Like, and he actually released it for free. He was doing this thing where it was like Trap Lord Tuesdays, put it out. No one ever thought that was going to be like a big hit. And then it just gradually built and like became like one of his biggest songs. Whereas like the first record I worked on with BTS, like everybody kind of knew, you know, it was like, this is something different. There's something special about it. But I think achieving what it became, it took a lot of like the nitty gritty work, like we were talking about, where like we were obsessing over different words, the comp, like how it felt overall, like whether it needed backgrounds in certain places. And like it was me and this vocal producer I work with a lot, Jenna Andrews, like she would go through, we would record a bunch of different things, and then we'd listen back and be like, no, that's too much, let's take these out. So it was sort of like trial and error until it felt cohesive. And I feel like because we all sort of had an idea of like the, you know, the magnitude or the potential it had, like I felt like it was sort of necessary to go through every possible like thing. So I feel like when you have an idea, you go through all the motions and you try everything because you know like this could be a huge song, you know. But there's other times where it's just very raw and creative and it happens and it becomes like a huge thing. So it's hard to tell, you know. Like sometimes
Sure,
you get an idea, and I've been in the situation where you think it's going to be big and like nothing happens too. So it's a funny thing, man.
It is for sure. And again, there's no right answer, because if you had the right answer, like, you know, you'd be
I'd be knocking them out every week. You know?
Exactly. On the BTS track, or the tracks, because I believe you did a couple. You did Dynamite, you did Butter, and then you did the Jason Derulo remix, right? With
Oh yeah, so yeah, it was like Dynamite, Butter,
and the Savage Love, the remix.
Savage Love, and then Permission to Dance was like the last one we.
Oh yes, okay, yeah, cool. Where were you in that the creative process? Were you the engineer or the mixer for those?
So for those, for Dynamite, it was mostly vocal engineering, which was like sort of what we were talking about, where it was, you know, comping, arrangement stuff, sort of thing.
So, like, can I ask a quick question about that? So, I'm not super familiar with that aspect of the industry yet. So, vocal engineering is, I guess, because vocals come in on a different day, you have a vocal engineer come in. Or
so pretty
like,
much in this situation, because they're in Korea, they record in Korea, and this was like COVID had just started, so like no one's traveling, you know. They're recording in Korea, and then we would receive files of like what they would record. So our job was to work pretty much on the vocals, perfect them, and then there was a separate. It was sort of simultaneous. There was a producer working on the music and the track, and we were sort of staying fluid in the sense we would get like an updated track, put it in our session, and go from there. And it's so vocal engineer is mostly where you're sitting on the track and you're making it work. Like it has to feel right, like the timing has to be right, because a lot of the times like the track that we're recording to was just sort of like the rough idea.
Yeah.
So when we receive vocals, they're sort of locked into that, but then if the producer changed the production a little bit, it's gonna like feel off. So it's like that sort of thing where you either nudging or like fixing little things that a lot of people aren't noticing right away, but in the grand scheme of things make the big difference.
Absolutely, for sure. Absolutely.
So for that one, it was mostly that. I did like rough mixes, but because of like the magnitude of the track and like at that particular time, I didn't have as much credits under my belt. So like it went to Serban clearly because he's like the G, for mixing. And then for Butter, it was interesting because I was sort of there.
That was Dynamite originally you were just talking about?
Dynamite, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
For Butter, and then for Savage Love was a similar situation because like, they couldn't travel. For Butter, it was unique because the people who produced the track also wrote the song. So I was there from the very beginning of like the songwriting sessions with the like whole crew of people, and then pretty much brought it up to like the rough mix. And then it went to I think it went, I went to Serban. So a lot of those bigger tracks, it's hard to sort of get into like the mixing role unless you already have like, the name behind it. But even going through the experience of it, you kind of understand like the process and like what they're looking for, which is what I always try to think of, like being on the end of like, oh, we're the ones getting the mix. I'm thinking like, oh, like when I send the mix, like this is what I need to do because like this is what they're looking for,
Yeah.
So a lot of it was engineering, vocal engineering, and Permission to Dance was like pretty much the same sort of thing, but that one was like it was like 4 or 5, like 400 and something vocal tracks, which is like.
Oh, I don't know.
They were all huge, but that one in particular, I remember. I remember printing the stems, and I'm like, I don't ever want to do this again.
So, what does that mean in the sense of how many of those did you use, or did you use all 400?
So there's like 7 dudes in the band, and then on top of that, they'll do harmonies, backgrounds, and then we'll add harmonies and backgrounds. So it's just layers, textures, stuff that if you take out, you don't necessarily notice, but you're like, that hook doesn't feel as big. Like, what's going on?
So you ended up using 400 vocal tracks.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh! So how many comps and stuff? That's like 1,500. I mean, that's even
so
if four takes for each track. That's 1,600 tracks or comps.
Yeah, dude. I feel like for the backgrounds and stuff, like we comped, but we didn't go as crazy.
Yeah.
But it's still like. It's a process.
Oh shoot! People put it. You know what that shows that they put in the work, and and you guys, the whole team included, everybody in the creative process put in the work, and it's a deserved hit. You know what I mean? Like I think people like, oh, I did 7 takes. I worked my butt off. Like why is this not a hit? Well, people are putting in the work. And that's actually very impressive.
No, totally. I think I remember. I think for Butter too, there was like a thing where we had a certain deadline, and in order to sort of meet it, we ended up like taking sections of the song. Each of us took a section and like comped, and then we put it all together in one session just because of like the sake of time,
Sure.
You're just trying to stay as efficient as possible, which is another fun part where you're like, I can do this, but how do I make this fast and like efficient,
I very much understand that. Actually, it's like debating that in my own life at the moment of like, okay, quality versus quantity. Where is that line? Like, I can do this faster, but where is that line of quality? And who cares in the end? Like, do people care more about the speed of it? Do people care more about the quality, or where's that fine line? I hear you, bro. I hear you.
Yeah, no, I juggle where my goal and everything is to try to do everything like as fast as I can, but to the standard that I hold myself.
Yes, absolutely.
And if I could do that, then I'm happy. But sometimes it's hard, and sometimes you gotta like sacrifice a little bit of the quickness in order, because you don't want to put something out there that's not going to be good or not up to your standards. It's like, but I play with that, and I'm always pushing it because I'm like, dude, if I could do that, then
I hear you, man. Absolutely. I think that whole conversation of all the people involved in the BTS production, all that, like we were talking about, Serb and everything, is a great segue into this next conversation, next question. I'd love to talk to you about like how you essentially got to where you are in the industry, and I think that part of the reason I like talking about this is because when I first started out, and I think that when so many other people start out, they're like, okay, that's really cool that we're doing all this stuff, but like, how did you even get there? Like, I remember for example, one memory I had is I dropped out of college to do music full time. And I was like, at the time, this was around like 2014 era. Ed Sheeran was just starting to get a little bit like some pretty good traction. He wasn't the superstar he is today, but like he was like I think on tour with Taylor Swift and stuff. Like so, he was doing his rounds of interviews, and I was like super inspired by the guy. And I was like listening to every interview, and one thing that kept coming up in all the interviews was the fact that in 2012 he had done 312 gigs. And here I was just dropped out of college, and I was like, that's sick. Like I'm ready to work. And I just couldn't get a single gig. I called hundreds of restaurants and bars and venues, and like I get a gig a month, and I'm like, I just don't even know how. Like willing to do it, I just didn't know how, and like so that's where I started this process of like I'm gonna document everything I do because I believe in where I'm going. I have some big dreams and stuff, and I want to show people along the process of how I got there. The roadmap's not going to be the same for everybody, but they can get little ideas and stuff. So I love hearing other people's perspectives to share. Like, how did you get there? What's some sort of roadmap of connections or anything like that?
So, I mean, I always tell people to like, it's good to learn from people that like you're. Let's say, you're trying to get to where you are or where I am right now. It's good to learn from people, but I always tell like, no one story is ever going to be the same. Like every situation is sort of different. For me, I mean, I'm originally South American, like from Colombia, and I grew up in upstate New York in this tiny town called Owego, which is like nothing going on up there, dude.
Owego?
Owego, New York, yeah.
So not Oswego.
No, Oswego is further north. It's like closer to Canada. This is close to like the biggest city you could think of was like Binghamton.
Oh yeah, sure, okay. I'm a native New Yorker, so I know, yeah.
Oh, gotcha, yeah. So it's like near Binghamton, but I started playing in metal bands up there, and that was like my thing. I was a drummer. I played bass, and I became interested in like audio engineering my last year of high school. I had no idea it was like even a profession, and I did like a 2-year program in a community college in Binghamton, used to record my band. And then I decided to move closer to New York because I was like, dude, this is dope. I want to keep this going. Originally, like the band was coming with me, but it ended up not happening. But, me and my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, like we made the move. And then I went to a 4-year school in like Westchester, and it was through a teacher there that I landed like my first internship. And it was, I think it was like, no, it was like my freshman year. I just connected with this teacher. He was great. And he connected me with the guy who's my manager now, but at the time he was managing Daddy's House recording studios for Puff. And that was my first internship. That was sort of like my introduction to like the music industry. And, it was not pretty, but you learned a lot. Like,
so tell me a little about that, because I think that we glorify what it looks like, and sometimes it really kind of sucks.
No,
so,
dude,
so elaborate.
I mean, my teacher kind of told me what it was, and like I'm the kind of person that like I want to know like the shitty stuff because I want to know what I'm in for. But it's it's like doing food runs, cleaning toilets, like being the bitch. But at the same time, you're in these rooms and like you learn to multitask in the sense of like, okay, I'm going to like fit whatever needs you may have, but I'm also watching how these records are being made and like what this guy's doing, how he's like carrying himself, what he's doing to like the stuff he's recording in order to like enhance it. So and
all the subconscious stuff that you're picking up too, like how to deal
and that's
with
what I tell people. It's
stuff.
like you could learn the rig, but it's sort of like this etiquette, how to deal with people.
Yes, exactly.
And like how to deal with situations you find yourself in, because sometimes like it's great, everybody loves you. Sometimes you have somebody who's pissed off at you, and like how do you diffuse the situation without somebody like freaking out,
Absolutely.
But I spent I think it was 4 years there, and I did from intern, sort of assistant, and then at the end I was like running sessions. But it ended up closing down because I think the lease was up and didn't get renewed. And after that, I spent a year at a smaller studio, but then I ended after about that year, I think it was like a year and a half, I ended up working at, it was like Downtown Music Publishing. They had their own studio in Soho. And that's sort of like the main hub where I met a lot of like the clients I still work with. Like that's where I met Jenna. I met Ferg, and I met Joey Badass, which I still work with occasionally when he's not, on the road. But from there, I would say another 3 or 4 years sort of doing sessions, and it's all sorts of stuff, that's why I love that place. It was like hip hop, pop. We would do like audiobook stuff. I remember we used to do morning sessions where it was like sync stuff, so like I would have to be there to like make sure shit ran smoothly for like a Kohl's voiceover commercial, like the woman who's like, this weekend at Kohl's sales, like that kind of shit.
Yeah, that's funny, man.
And I was pretty much there until right before COVID started. Like they were in the process of like expanding the facility, but then because of COVID, it got shut down. And
so
then
are you still based in New York?
Yeah, I'm based in New York. I travel a lot to LA now, but I've toyed with the idea of moving out there, but as of now, I'm still, New York based.
Yeah, man. New York for life, baby. New York for life.
Yeah, I've been out there, but I don't know, East Coast forever.
100%, man. Absolutely. I've been out there a couple of times more recently, and I'm like, it's cool, but it's not New York, man.
It's different, yeah.
It's very different. It's very, very different. I like the New York culture of like, you tell people how it is. In LA, it's like...
That's exactly it.
Is a little. They don't tell it how it is, and I was like, no, man, I don't like that. I like the roughness of New York.
I do too. That's why I say it's like I would rather be like, you know what, I don't fuck with you, but like we're gonna do this because this is the gig, as opposed to just like
sure. Man, dude, it's so funny. Last time I was in LA, I literally the day I got back, I was picking up my car. My sister lives in Queens, and I was picking up the car from Queens because I left it there, and I literally pull out, and immediately some guy gives me the middle finger. Right, I'm like, welcome to New York, babe.
Come home.
Oh shoot, it's so funny, man. So to recap that, to segue back to what you were talking about.
Yeah.
How long? So based on the storyline, it seems like, how many years in between? It seems like it's been a while you've been in the industry.
It has. So I think like I moved to closer to New York. I think it was originally like 2012.
Okay.
And then I think it was like three and a half years like working for Puff. It was like a year in between, like a smaller studio, and then like at downtown it was like 4 years or something like that.
Yeah. So it's one thing I really just want to reiterate and recap of the story is, in so many of these interviews that I've done, and so many people that have seen, great quote unquote success, or however you want to define it, like a lot of these stories sound very similar in the aspect of like, you put the work in, man. I like, for example, like very, very similar story. I just was speaking to DJ Swivel, who's a producer out in LA, and
he's dope, man. Yeah,
he's a great guy, but very, very almost exact similar story. He moved from somewhere else, but to New York, got an internship at very low level, was doing the food running, was clean. Literally, it's like word for word, doing the food running, cleaning the toilets, getting coffee, and so many other people that I've spoken to have the same story. But now look where they are now, and it's just like being willing to humble yourself and do that work.
Totally,
leads to getting to where you are now. I
always looked at it, and then there was like, because for instance, like after Puff Studio closed, at that point I was doing sessions, and when I started working at downtown, because like I didn't know the owner as well as I had the relationship with the past owner, so like I had to do the whole going from running sessions to sort of going back and like proving myself, and like that can be excruciating and like annoying. Sure. But like having done that, I learned more and was put in these situations where it sort of elevated me to another level. And like another thing I always tell people too is just like you're always sort of preparing for the opportunity to come, and like when it comes you got to be ready. So that's how I looked at it. I was like, like I'm running food again, but whatever, there's going to be a point where like somebody's not going to show up, somebody's going to get sick, they're going to need somebody to run the session, and I'm going to be ready. So exactly. It's like I always you got to look at it sort of in that way, because otherwise like you drive yourself crazy, because it's music is, there's ups and downs no matter what. Even like the big dudes who do like the big records, like you sort of learn to ride the wave, and even as artists, where they'll have a hit, and that could be it. You know what I mean? Like,
It's terrifying. It's terrifying. I would say all the time, I'd so much rather never, ever, ever have a hit than to have a one-hit wonder.
Yeah,
I was
that's
like,
the worst.
don't give it to me and then take it away. Like, just don't give it to me at all at that point. You know what I mean? I'll just chase it forever rather than have it and then lose it. Oh my gosh, no way.
Exactly, and that's what people say. So if you got a hit, you got to be working twice as hard. You can't get comfortable.
100%.
Following that up is the hardest thing you'll ever do.
100. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I really appreciate that, man. You had some really, really great perspective. I want to play a 2-second little fun little game that I've been doing in the introducing to the interviews called Overrated, Underrated. And I'd love to hear your quick little responses. I'm going to throw a couple things out there, and you say if it's overrated in the industry or underrated in the industry.
Okay.
All right? We're going to start off with LPs, like long form albums.
Like albums?
Yeah, as opposed to like singles. Singles or LPs, I guess.
I would say underrated, but
Okay, cool.
I love albums, like,
sure,
but nowadays
following the coattails, vinyl.
I would say overrated. I don't know.
Okay.
I love vinyl. Don't get me wrong. I just feel like it's been romanticized a lot. Like,
sure, absolutely. No, it's totally subjective, and I love hearing just people's perspectives. Absolutely, it's fun. Console gear,
like
the Neves and the SSLs and stuff.
Oh man, this is a tough one. I will say overrated only because of like the cost. Like what you can achieve now with plugins, it's so close that it's like.
Let's follow that up with what's an underrated plugin then.
An underrated plugin. Let me think. I'm trying to think, but everybody.
Personal taste again. Complete personal taste.
Let's say the soft tube saturator, because like it's free and like not a lot of people use it. Like they typically use like the Cavitator, or I think Waves has like a new one, but it's free and I'm a huge fan of it. It's dope.
Sure, absolutely, man. I hear you. All right, last one. Throw a little knife out there. Los Angeles. Just kidding.
Man.
I'm just kidding, man. What?
Let's say overrated. It's just, I don't know.
That's funny.
I love my LA people, man. I got friends out there. It's just, I don't know.
Oh shoot! It's just because we had that conversation. It's too funny. We're both New Yorkers, man. That's why I said it. Oh shoot! That's funny, man. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, man. Last question I'd like to wrap it up with everybody that I have on the channel is, what is something that you currently know now in your career that you wish you knew when you first started off?
Something I wish I knew when I started?
Yeah, that you know now.
I would say, I don't know. I almost wish I don't know if I would change anything, just because I feel like the idea I had of what it was like going to be, like sort of playing the role of engineering, was like so different than like it actually is. But I almost like the fact that I didn't know it, because I learned more by kind of screwing up at times and like, being in a situation where like, dude, I don't want to ever be in that suck. You know what I mean? Whether it's like, if I knew about it, I feel like I wouldn't have even, in the mindset I was when I was younger, I'm like, I don't know if I would want to do that. You know what I mean?
I think that is actually a great answer. That's a cool answer. I think that most people don't give answers like that. They've given, they'll give specific things that they've learned over the years. But I think that's actually really great perspective. And like, so I just recently put on a concert like in the past couple months, and people like, oh, like, what do you think? What would you do differently? And I was like, honestly, like, it sucked putting on this concert. But like, I gave the same answer. I was like, I wouldn't honestly do anything different because I learned so much. I know next time I'm definitely gonna do different. But from this, like, I learned so much that I don't know if I'd want to give that opportunity up of learning it.
No, exactly.
I keep the discomfort over the learning.
Because when you're in those situations, like, that's what you really learn. You're not just like somebody telling you like, oh, don't do this. Like when you're in that situation, whether you fucked up, you lost a vocal, or like something's not working.
Oh shoot!
Like that's
my stomach just dropped on that one, dude. How do you handle that?
Oh, dude. I mean,
that sucks.
I had one that I remember specifically where we were recording. I don't know what happened. Some weird glitch happened, and then
that's the worst, man.
We opened the session back up and it was like all blank, and like somehow the audio files got sent to like a different folder or something, so I had to literally like find it and then spot them back in the session. But it, you know, in that moment, and that you're thinking like, "Fuck, dude, I'm scared," you know. And that's, you learn to think calmly on your feet instead of freaking out, because otherwise you're gonna do more stupid shit, you know.
Yeah, for sure, man. Absolutely. No, that's terrifying.
No, dude. I mean,
100%.
but see, you know, as much as they suck, like we're saying, I welcome that, because then you learn how to fix it in case you're ever in the situation, and then you're training your mind to sort of be calm and like solve problems whenever they come your way, you know. So
yeah, man, I couldn't agree more.
It's a win-win. That's how I try to look at it, you know.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. You know, like as much as it sucks, like you'll never do that again, or two, you'll know how to handle it if it comes up again.
Yeah. And if you do, you know how to fix it. You know,
absolutely. Like, shoot, man, that's so funny. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. If we could hang out for 30 more seconds, I just want to say thank you so much to every single person that made it this far in the interview. You guys are the true ones. Appreciate you very much. Definitely go check out everything that we've been chatting. Definitely go back and listen to this a second time. Take some notes and go back and check out all the tracks that Juan's been working on, and all the stuff that follow him on social media and everything. Best way to support this channel is checking out my own music and subscribing on whatever platform you're listening to. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out with us today. Have a great day. God bless and peace out.